Tonight, a Klan leader's threat against Bumpy Johnson's family sparks a midnight turning point in Harlem.
Montgomery, Alabama, 11:58 p.m. Friday, June 22, 1956. Hot air clung to the skin like wet cloth. Moonlight leaked through a veil of factory smoke, settling over shotgun houses and rust-red clay roads. A Packard Clipper idled outside a modest two-story home on Holt Street. Its chrome grille reflected the porch light like a set of clenched teeth. Inside the car sat Edward "Red" Cafferty, a regional coordinator for the Ku Klux Klan. White linen gloves, stiff suit, a cigarette clipped between yellowed teeth. Cafferty was a man accustomed to intimidation as a professional craft. 2 minutes before midnight, he stepped out, tapping ash onto the walkway. He carried a folded sheet of paper and a length of cotton rope, a symbolic ultimatum designed to humiliate through historical terror. He approached the porch with slow precision, boots crushing gravel underfoot. From inside, the faint sound of Billie Holiday played from a radio, a fragile slice of normalcy seconds away from eradication. On that porch lived Bumpy Johnson and her young niece. They were family to a Harlem figure whose name traveled through prisons, political backrooms, and policy offices alike. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, the underworld tactician with Ivy League diction and knife-fight instincts. To most men, the name was myth. To Cafferty, it was an opportunity for dominance. He hammered the door twice. No answer. He tacked the note to the wood with a pocket knife, then looped the cotton rope around the porch pillar. Not a noose, but close enough to imply it. The note contained 9 words, written in block capitals. "Tell your Harlem ape to go back north." The slur was deliberate. The rope was deliberate. The goal was humiliation through racial theater. A staged strike against a man the Klan believed was just another criminal. Cafferty walked back to his Packard satisfied. He believed the insult was complete. He was catastrophically wrong. By 12:14 a.m., Mamie's neighbor had already telephoned Harlem. At 12:29 a.m., Bumpy Johnson was informed while seated in a private backroom of Wells Restaurant on 7th Avenue. Witnesses later described his reaction as clinical. No shouting, no profanity. The fork was set quietly beside the plate. He buttoned his jacket. He requested a list of names. His only verbal response, "This will be corrected." The storm that followed was not immediate gunfire. It was systematic communication, calls placed through political fixers, messages relayed through Southern policy networks. Klan organizers who once gloated over cross burnings found their credit frozen, their distributors seized, their secret business interests exposed like nerve endings. And when that still failed to produce an apology, the violence escalated in the only language men like Cafferty respected. Nighttime, roadside, unavoidable. 6 days later, at 3:03 a.m., headlights would flash across an abandoned lumber yard outside Montgomery. A body would be found kneeling, hands broken, jaw wired shut with baling wire. A note pinned to his collar read, "1 down, 3 to go." The story of how Edward "Red" Cafferty lost everything is a warning that history has tried to hide. If you enjoy these deep dives into the underworld, you can support the channel by buying me a coffee using the link in the description. Your support keeps these investigations alive. Now, let's go back to June 22, 1956. Montgomery in 1956 functioned as a controlled system of intimidation. Segregated buses, segregated schools, segregated cemeteries. The police enforced customs with bureaucratic composure, and the Ku Klux Klan operated as an auxiliary arm of social regulation. In that era, cross burnings were less a spectacle and more a municipal reminder, the same way parking tickets remind drivers who controls the sidewalks. The governor's office condemned violence publicly while staffers privately exchanged handshakes with men who owned hoods and torches. It was an ecosystem designed to keep the hierarchy intact through routine humiliation. Edward "Red" Cafferty thrived in that environment. He was white, middle-aged, and economically secure through a lumber brokerage that supplied half the county. His clan status granted him leverage in procurement chains, loan approvals, and courtrooms. When clerks refused service to black veterans, Cafferty was the kind of man they nodded to afterward. He embodied structural disrespect packaged in a tailored suit and linen gloves. To him, fear was a commodity distributed with precision. The week leading up to June 22nd carried attention that locals considered normal. A church in West Montgomery reported threats. Flyers with racial slurs spread across a schoolyard. A brick was thrown through a grocer's window. The police wrote up vandalism reports with mechanical detachment, avoiding any mention of white supremacy. It was into that climate that Cafferty began drafting his midnight message. It was not spontaneous. It was planned, rehearsed, and loaded with generational symbolism. The cotton rope represented agricultural servitude. The note represented white civic authority. He wanted maximum humiliation with minimum blood, because humiliation sustained power longer than bullets. His target was not random. Through Southern business channels, he had learned that Mamie Johnson, wife of Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, was temporarily in Montgomery tending to a sick aunt. To Cafferty, this was an opportunity to make an example out of a northern figure he considered disruptive. The rumors about Bumpy circulated even in Dixie: Harlem gangster, numbers operator, political fixer, protector of black neighborhoods. Those rumors irritated men like Cafferty because they inverted the standard narrative. A black man with influence destabilized their sense of inherited superiority. So the operation took shape: a rope, a note, a timed arrival 1 minute before midnight. It would be executed calmly, like posting a letter. Holt Street at night carried the metallic odor of rail yards mixed with fried grease from late-night diners. Crickets filled the quiet between passing headlights. At 11:58 p.m., Cafferty's Packard Clipper rolled to a stop outside the Johnson residence. He stepped out, straightened his jacket, and checked his watch. The street was deserted but not asleep. Curtains fluttered. Porch fans buzzed. A single dog barked once, then went silent. Cafferty walked to the porch and tested the door with 2 sharp knocks. No answer. He unfolded the note and pressed it flat against the wood. His pocket knife pinned it with 2 swift taps. Then he looped the rope around a support post with deliberate economy, letting the ends fall just enough to imply danger without confirming it. He chose symbolism over overt threat because symbolism traveled further by rumor. Inside the house, Mamie Johnson's niece heard the knocks but froze. She peeked from behind a curtain just in time to see Cafferty retreat to his car. She saw the rope. She saw the note. She saw the white gloves. She waited until the Packard's taillights faded, then ran to the porch barefoot. The note tore easily from the wood. The message hit with the force of a blow. The slur was written in block capitals designed to deliver maximum degradation. It did not merely target Bumpy. It targeted lineage, heritage, and dignity. That was phase 1 of the intended humiliation: disrespect delivered publicly, relying on fear to silence retaliation. But the assumption behind that calculation was flawed. Cafferty assumed the woman would not call anyone. He assumed fear would achieve compliance. Instead, by 12:05 a.m., neighbors were gathered on the sidewalk. They analyzed the message with a forensic intensity born of survival. They dissected the rope's length, the handwriting style, the meaning behind the missing knot. One neighbor recognized the Packard, or at least claimed to. Information circulated through the block with the precision of a data network. The insult did not achieve silence, it triggered movement. At 12:09 a.m., a retired Pullman porter used his rotary phone to call a Harlem-connected undertaker he knew from union days. At 12:17 a.m., That undertaker called a restaurant in Manhattan that doubled as a message hub for political fixers and underworld intermediaries. Names changed hands, addresses were confirmed, and within minutes the situation escalated beyond Montgomery's jurisdiction. By 12:29 a.m., Bumpy Johnson received the news mid-meal. He listened without blinking. He asked for the exact wording of the note. He asked whether the rope had a knot. He asked whether the porch light was on when the message was delivered. These details mattered because humiliation had parameters, and retaliation required precision calibrated to those parameters. Witnesses described no emotional reaction, no verbal threats. He placed his fork down. He stood. He buttoned his jacket. Then he made a phone call to obtain Cafferty's financial architecture, bank liens, supplier relationships, outstanding debts. Bumpy understood that the fastest path to public collapse was not a bullet, but a ledger. The chapter closes here, a phone clicks, and miles away in Montgomery, Edward Red Cafferty sleeps under the illusion that power remains static. He has no concept of the countdown that has already begun. Harlem in the 1950s was a sovereign economy disguised as a neighborhood. Inside that grid of brownstones and neon storefronts existed bankers without licenses, judges without robes, and mayors without ballots. The legitimate city government collected taxes. The unofficial government collected respect. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson operated at the intersection of those two governments, moving like a diplomat between district attorneys and street corner bookmakers. To outsiders, he was a criminal. To residents, he was infrastructure. The night the call came in, he was seated inside Wells' restaurant on 7th Avenue, a neutral zone where politicians, union stewards, hustlers, and musicians shared booths without acknowledging each other. The air smelled of fried chicken fat and cigarette paper. Waitresses weaved between tables with military precision. At 12:29 a.m., a doorman entered the back room and whispered into Bumpy's ear. The room did not react. There was no shift in conversation, no sudden tension. Only Bumpy's posture changed, his shoulders squared, his head tilted slightly toward the messenger, and his fork lowered to the plate. The information was delivered in fragments: rope on the porch, note on the door, Klan forcer, Alabama. His wife was the target through proximity. Those facts were enough to establish disrespect, but Bumpy needed more. He requested the exact wording of the note because wording revealed intent. He requested confirmation on whether the rope was tied because knots signaled escalation. He requested the time of delivery because timing revealed theater. Each answer was absorbed without visible emotional response. The waiter clearing plates later stated he had seen men learn about murdered brothers and show more expression. Bumpy left Wells without raising his voice or making a threat. Outside, 7th Avenue was still awake. Cars double-parked, dominoes cracked on milk crates. Preachers shouted into early morning microphones about salvation. Bumpy ignored it all. He entered a waiting sedan and instructed the driver to head to Lenox Avenue. The driver did not ask why. Men who worked for Bumpy understood the difference between conversation and orders. Inside a brown brick apartment building, on the 3rd floor, lived a policy banker named Clarence Bookman Hughes. He ran numbers for Harlem but also maintained ledgers for white businessmen in the garment district who did not want their gambling habits on tax records. Bookman handled information rather than bullets, making him an asset in situations requiring discretion. At 12:51 a.m., Bumpy entered his apartment without knocking. Bookman was wearing suspenders and reading a newspaper with his feet up. He lowered the paper as soon as he saw who it was. No greetings were exchanged. Bumpy handed him a slip of paper with a name, Edward Red Cafferty. Bookman understood immediately. He stood, removed a lockbox from under the floorboard, and began dialing numbers on a rotary phone. At 1:06 a.m., The first call reached a Teamsters union representative who controlled freight shipments between New York and the Southeast. At 1:22 a.m., another call reached a real estate broker in Atlanta who handled discreet purchases for wealthy segregationists. At 1:35 a.m., a third call reached a funeral director in Birmingham who doubled as a political courier for both civil rights groups and underworld brokers. Bumpy stood silently, listening. He made no demands. He simply waited for the web to deploy itself. By 2:04 a.m., Bookman had compiled a dossier. Cafferty owned a lumber brokerage with 3 state contracts. He relied on 2 credit lines from banks in Montgomery and Mobile. He had warehouse space leased from a shipping firm partially financed by New York investors who disliked scandal. He also had private insurance policies underwritten by a firm headquartered in Atlanta. Each detail represented a pressure point. Bumpy read the list once. He asked one question: any children? Bookman confirmed 1 daughter in college. Bumpy nodded. Family stays out of this, he said. That was not mercy. That was policy. At 2:17 a.m., Bumpy left Bookman's apartment and walked 2 blocks to a row house that functioned as a political switchboard. It was operated by a woman named Geneva Saunders, former NAACP organizer turned unofficial diplomat between street power and electoral power. She handled conversations that could not exist in official minutes. When Bumpy arrived, she was boiling coffee and reviewing typed reports. He handed her the same slip of paper. She scanned it briefly. Then she said, "Southern boys like that don't listen until their wallet screams." Bumpy replied, "Then we make it scream first." That was as close to emotional language as he allowed. Geneva executed Phase 1 at the bureaucratic level. Before dawn, she contacted 2 attorneys who had influence in municipal contracting. They began drafting anonymous complaints alleging irregularities in Cafferty's lumber contracts. Another associate sent a quiet inquiry to the Atlanta insurance firm about ethics violations. These actions did not damage Cafferty directly. They weakened his circle. Corruption was rarely vulnerable to bullets, but it was allergic to paperwork. By sunrise, Harlem had shifted from awareness to calculation. Bumpy returned to his building on West 147th Street. He did not pace. He did not rant. He sat at his kitchen table and read a book of poems by County Cullen. That quiet posture was deliberate. Rage wasted energy. Precision required stillness. Meanwhile, in Montgomery, rumors began to circulate through the business community hours before Cafferty even woke up. A banker expressed concern to a colleague about irregularities on freight invoices. A state contractor mentioned that a New York supplier was suddenly asking invasive questions. None of these men knew they were observing the opening seconds of a strategy. At 7:58 a.m., Cafferty finally learned that something was wrong. His secretary informed him that a supplier refused shipment pending new compliance confirmations. At 9:12 a.m., the bank requested clarification on his credit line. At 10:47 a.m., an insurance auditor called regarding his records. These were not coincidences. They were opening cuts designed to weaken his sense of invulnerability before the second phase. Back in Harlem, the final step of the day occurred in silence. Bumpy wrote a list of 4 names on a sheet of paper and folded it into his jacket. Those names represented targets, but not necessarily victims. They were men whose removal would accelerate pressure. He never explained how he chose the names. He simply told his driver, "Alabama needs to remember its manners." The chapter concludes as Bumpy closes the jacket and steps out into the Harlem afternoon. No gunfire, no threats, just the architecture of retaliation assembling itself with bureaucratic patience. The countdown continues, and Cafferty has not yet realized it has begun. Retaliation in Harlem rarely started with bullets. It started with signatures, audits, and unsigned telephone calls that triggered chain reactions in distant offices filled with middle-aged clerks who had never heard the name Bumpy Johnson. The objective was simple: destabilize Cafferty's business before touching his body. A man with fear in his ledger behaves differently than a man with fear in his lungs. At 2:41 p.m. on June 23rd, the first maneuver hit the Montgomery lumber brokerage when the Atlanta insurance firm issued a request for documentation regarding recent claims discrepancies. The language was standard, bureaucratic, and deliberately vague. It created uncertainty without accusation. Insurance companies were the nervous system of mid-century Southern business. Any hint of irregularity sent shockwaves into contractors, bankers, and municipal offices that depended on those policies for legal cover. Cafferty's secretary placed the letter on his desk. He glanced at it for less than 10 seconds before dismissing it into the out tray. He believed it was bureaucratic noise. He did not yet understand that Harlem had begun writing his obituary in paperwork. At 4:03 p.m., the second maneuver landed through a freight distributor in Savannah. A manager contacted Montgomery Lumber, requesting proof of environmental compliance for a routine shipment. This was unusual. Lumber in the 1950s did not encounter environmental scrutiny. The request was a strategic irritant designed to slow product movement. When product slowed, money slowed. When money slowed, power eroded. The Klan measured their influence through intimidation. Bumpy measured influence through liquidity. By 5:19 p.m., a third strike reached the Montgomery banking sector. A discreet inquiry from a New York firm asked whether Cafferty's credit lines were currently secured against shipment-backed receivables. To a banker, this sounded like a competitor sniffing weakness. To Cafferty's loan officer, it meant risk. Risk required review. Reviews required pauses. Pauses created bottlenecks. Cafferty did not know the inquiry existed until his loan officer scheduled a discussion for the following Monday. That single word, discussion, was code for scrutiny. At 7:02 p.m., Bumpy convened a small circle in his apartment. Geneva Saunders, Bookman Hughes, and the Teamsters representative sat at his kitchen table. No cigarettes, no liquor, no forced camaraderie, just data points exchanged without embellishment. Geneva reported that municipal contractors in Montgomery were already whispering about upcoming bids. Bookman confirmed that one of Cafferty's suppliers had requested to review their partnership. The Teamster reported that 2 freight containers had been quietly rerouted, delaying arrival by at least 72 hours. Each detail was logged without celebration. Bumpy nodded once and said, "Don't touch his family. Don't touch his properties. Touch what he thinks makes him a man." That meant finances, contracts, and reputation. The next morning, June 24th, delivered the first sign that the pressure was reaching Cafferty's lungs. At 9:11 a.m., his secretary informed him that Mobile State Bank was reassessing collateral requirements. At 10:47 a.m., a contractor in Birmingham abruptly requested a renegotiation of pricing. By noon, a Savannah supplier refused shipment until documentation issues were resolved. Individually, these events were inconveniences. Together, they described a systematic assault. At 2:15 p.m., Cafferty contacted a state liaison expecting political insulation. The liaison offered none. Men who wore hoods at night hated scandal in the daytime. Cafferty asked whether the governor could intervene. The liaison responded that contractor disputes are outside our influence. Those words were not loyalty, they were abandonment. By 3:02 p.m., panic replaced arrogance. Cafferty began calling contacts in Atlanta seeking clarification. None answered. Silent phones are more violent than threats. Silence signals abandonment. Abandonment decays confidence. Confidence is the skeleton of power. Exactly 6 hours and 43 minutes after the initial insurance request, At 9:24 p.m., a courier delivered an unmarked envelope to Cafferty's residence. Inside was a single sheet of paper with typed text, "Midnight is not finished." No signature, no symbol, only 5 words and a timestamp in the corner, 12:29. That timestamp was not random. It was the time Bumpy received the original insult. Revenge communicated through precision. Cafferty read it 3 times. His wife asked if it was related to business. He lied and said yes. But his mind was already calculating risk. Men like him were fluent in intimidation when they had the advantage. Without advantage, that fluency evaporated. Behind the scenes, Harlem escalated quietly. Geneva contacted a journalist in Atlanta who specialized in business reporting. She planted rumors about potential procurement corruption in Montgomery. Bookman arranged for an audit inquiry to be forwarded to multiple departments simultaneously. The Teamster confirmed that additional freight delays could be enforced by paper jams at Southern yards. At 11:58 p.m., almost exactly 24 hours after the original rope incident, Bumpy stood at his window in Harlem looking at the street. He did not celebrate, he did not speak. Revenge was not emotional, it was mathematical. The first phase was complete, destabilization without exposure. The chapter closes as Cafferty sits awake in his home office surrounded by papers, cigarette smoke, and unanswered questions. He stares at the typed note on his desk. He does not yet know who sent it. He does not yet know why. But for the first time in his life, Edward Red Cafferty understands the sensation of being hunted by someone who does not need to raise his voice to dismantle a man. The countdown continues. Pressure did not take long to register in Montgomery's extremist ecosystem. When economic fractures appeared in a white man's business, the Klan interpreted it as a geopolitical threat rather than a financial inconvenience. Their worldview treated power as a zero-sum calculation. If a white man lost control, someone else had taken it. And in 1950s Alabama, the idea that an unseen black strategist could apply pressure without firing a shot was unthinkable. That disbelief became fuel for retaliation. On June 25, 1956, at 8:41 a.m., a rank-and-file Klansman named Russell Duke entered Cafferty's office. He did not knock. He did not remove his hat. He demanded explanations. Cafferty could not provide any. His insurance audit was expanding. His freight partner was stalling. His credit line was under review. Duke stared at him with the blunt hostility of a man who believed political dominance exempted him from consequences. "Somebody's testing you," Duke said. "You better show them how this works in Alabama." Cafferty nodded, but answered nothing. Silence was the first sign that his confidence was deteriorating. By midday, retaliation had been decided, not strategic retaliation, emotional retaliation. At 6:12 p.m., a warehouse on the outskirts of Birmingham owned by an associate of Bumpy Johnson was set on fire. The owner was a mortician and occasional courier. His business had no obvious link to Harlem. That was intentional. The Klan favored abstract punishment. Hurt the network, not the target. No fatalities occurred, but the message was unmistakable. The Klan was aware that connections existed beyond state borders, and it intended to display dominance through spectacle. News of the fire reached Harlem by 1:10:06 p.m., transmitted via long-distance operator through coded language. Geneva Saunders was the first to hear it. She informed Bumpy at 10:19 p.m. inside the same kitchen where plans were drafted the night before. Geneva expected agitation. Instead, she witnessed composure. He asked 2 questions, anyone hurt, and how many trucks were inside. Geneva answered both. Bumpy responded, they're probing for fear. Then he read the freight reports again, as if fire was merely weather. Retaliation in Alabama escalated further that week. Flyers appeared in black neighborhoods with warnings about outside agitators. Anonymous calls threatened local ministers. A church was vandalized with paint. None of these acts targeted Harlem directly, but they were designed to shift the psychological battlefield. The Klan wanted to remind the city that spectacle still belonged to them. But Klan theatrics created two unintended consequences. First, they attracted attention from federal observers. Second, they accelerated the timeline of Harlem's strategy. On June 27th at 1:33 p.m., a man in a gray suit visited Cafferty's lumber office. He was not a Klansman, he was not a banker, he was not law enforcement. He was a private investigator, dispatched by New York investors who had received whispers about instability. This man represented capital, and capital disliked unpredictability. When he left at 2:15 p.m., he carried documents confirming that Cafferty's financial architecture was vulnerable. That report would circulate through Atlanta, Memphis, and Jacksonville within 72 hours. Meanwhile, on the ground, retaliation continued to miss its intended mark. Men burned a warehouse, but they did not know who controlled the freight. They threatened ministers, but they did not know who controlled the unions. They vandalized churches, but they did not know who controlled political donations. Harlem operated upstream from Southern violence, on ledgers, on contracts, on influence. At 8:41 p.m., on June 29th, the first direct casualty of this indirect war disappeared. His name was Walter Mack Kinnan, an acquaintance of Cafferty and occasional Klan courier. He was last seen leaving a hardware store with a box of nails and a sack of feed. Witnesses recalled nothing unusual. His truck was found idling on the shoulder of a rural road 6 hours later, engine running, lights on, driver missing. No blood, no visible struggle, just absence. That absence traveled faster than rumors. Men who assumed they controlled the night suddenly felt examined by the dark. Cafferty learned of Mack Kinnan's disappearance at 6:55 a.m. the next morning. He read the police report twice, then shoved it into a drawer. His wife observed him pacing for the first time since their marriage. Pacing represented vulnerability. Men who controlled their environment did not pace. By noon, Cafferty contacted senior Klan leadership. He expected reinforcement. Instead, he received caution. Violence was permissible. Public scandal was not. There would be no official mobilization. No sanctioned manhunt. Only deniable whispers. Across the country, Harlem experienced none of this noise. Bumpy remained silent, treating retaliation like an experimental variable rather than an emotional provocation. Geneva continued paperwork offensives. Bookman continued credit disruptions. The Teamster continued freight blockages. This silence enraged Montgomery more than any speech. The chapter closes at 10:48 p.m. on June 30th. Cafferty sits alone in his living room, curtains pulled shut, cigarette smoke filling the air. He reviews missing person reports, loan documents, and burned warehouse articles. He senses an adversary but cannot name him. He senses a strategy but cannot decode it. Outside, across the street, a car idles for 12 seconds, then drives away without headlights. Cafferty realizes the problem is no longer contracts or shipments. It is now survival. And survival is a field where arrogance becomes a liability. By July 1st, 1956, the conflict had shifted from insult to infrastructure. Harlem understood that a man like Edward Red Cafferty relied on 3 pillars for power, credit, freight, and reputation. Remove any one of them and the man wobbles. Remove all 3 and the man collapses. Bumpy Johnson aimed for collapse, not chaos. Chaos was emotional. Collapse was structural. The pivot began at 12:14 p.m. when the Teamsters representative placed a call to a Savannah Yard foreman. The instruction was simple: slow the paperwork. No threats, no bribery, just a bureaucratic deceleration. Freight yards in the 1950s were temples of paper. Every crate, log bundle, and railcar required signatures, approvals, confirmations, and stamped slips that allowed commerce to move. Without those slips, shipments froze in place like evidence locked behind glass. At 2:07 p.m., the first of Cafferty's lumber consignments entered this freeze. Yard workers placed colored tags on crates indicating hold pending. Colored tags traveled faster than rumors. Within hours, contractors began calling Cafferty demanding arrival updates he could not provide. Simultaneously, Geneva deployed the second prong, reputational contamination. At 3:55 p.m., she met with an Atlanta reporter inside a cafe known for discreet political conversations. She did not mention the Klan. She did not mention Harlem. She did not mention Bumpy. She simply provided a file containing procurement irregularities and whispered the phrase, state favoritism. No journalist in the southeastern United States ignored those words in 1956. They triggered investigations, hearings, and bureaucratic performance for the sake of optics. She left the cafe without finishing her coffee. The reporter left with a story that could burn quietly for weeks. The third prong belonged to Bookman Hughes. At 6:03 p.m., he dialed a contact in Jacksonville who handled financing for Southern lumber firms. Bookman spoke less than a minute. The message, do not extend credit beyond 30 days. For an industry built on net 60 cycles, that order functioned like a choke collar. Companies dependent on monthly rotation needed 60 days to survive. 30 days forced them to cannibalize reserves, liquidate assets, or negotiate humiliating bridge loans. When Cafferty attempted to negotiate new terms 2 days later, the Jacksonville office declined with bureaucratic politeness. Politeness has no sympathy, it has procedure. Meanwhile, in Montgomery, the Klan attempted to mimic these moves with the tools they understood: intimidation, spectacle, and rumor. But spectacle did not stop insurance audits. Rumor did not move freight. Intimidation did not resolve credit reviews. The Klan operated on cultural dominance. Harlem operated on logistical dominance. Cultural dominance collapses the moment men stop believing in it. Logistical dominance collapses only when ledgers balance again, and ledgers do not balance under siege. On the night of July 2nd at 10:57 p.m., Bumpy initiated the fourth maneuver, physical reconnaissance. He sent 2 men south, not to kill but to observe. They took a train to Atlanta, then another to Montgomery. They carried no weapons, just notepads, maps, and 2 photographs of Edward Cafferty. Their assignment was not violence, it was geography. They would map Cafferty's residence, his office, the lumber yard, his club, his favorite diner, and the Klan hall. Harlem never struck blind. Harlem cataloged movement. At 3:12 p.m. on July 3rd, one of the men observed Cafferty entering the Montgomery Country Club. He logged the time. At 3:54 p.m., he observed him exit. He logged that time too. By nightfall, the reconnaissance team established a pattern: Monday lunch meetings, Tuesday warehouse inspections, Thursday night card games, and church on Sunday with deliberate punctuality. Patterns were vulnerabilities waiting to be exploited. While reconnaissance continued, the business pressure reached a breaking point. On July 5th, at 9:18 a.m., Cafferty's secretary informed him that a federal accountant requested documentation regarding timber valuation discrepancies. That was a different class of threat. State audits could be bullied. Federal accountants could not. Federal inquiries endangered contracts, and contracts were the bloodstream of Southern businessmen who funded local politics through quiet bid rigging. When the accountant asked for a meeting, Cafferty declined, offering to gather records first. Declining a federal meeting bought time, but raised suspicion. At 11:32 a.m., Cafferty contacted a local judge for assistance. The judge refused involvement, advising him to let the matter resolve administratively. That phrase translated to abandonment disguised as prudence. When power structures sense vulnerability, they retract rather than reinforce. Cafferty felt that retraction immediately. At 10:41 p.m. that night, Harlem executed the quietest maneuver of the conflict. One of Bumpy's men pinned a single envelope to the door of a state contractor's office in Atlanta. Inside was a typed message: "Do not renew with Montgomery Lumber. Risk classified." It contained no threat, no signature, no leverage. Yet in procurement politics, risk outweighs loyalty. The envelope traveled from the contractor's desk to a board meeting in less than 48 hours. By the following Monday, the contract renewal was delayed for review. By July 7th, the economic choke was nearly complete. Freight slowed to 30%. Credit tightened to 50%. Contract renewals froze. Insurance audits expanded. Journalistic interest stirred. And a private investigator from New York compiled an internal memo recommending divestment within the quarter. Cafferty sensed siege but could not locate the walls. He blamed competitors. He blamed Atlanta bankers. He blamed union interference. The one thing he never considered was Harlem. To him, Harlem was culture, not structure. Music, numbers, bars, and gossip. He did not understand that Harlem had diplomats, actuaries, freight strategists, procurement contacts, and political architects who operated with cold precision. The chapter closes at 11:58 p.m. on July 7th. In a hotel room in Atlanta, one of Bumpy's men writes a short message in a notebook. Pattern confirmed. He eats alone on Thursdays. He closes the notebook. He turns off the lamp. The logistics are complete. Next would come application. The countdown has moved from paperwork to proximity. The cooling towers behind the lumber depot exhaled pale industrial smoke into a quiet dawn that did not belong to Queens. Wind carried the metallic scent of wet rails and old gasoline. It was 6:03 a.m., a Sunday. The city was yawning awake, but inside a boarded-up maintenance shed, the Klan leadership sat on folding chairs with their hands tied behind their backs, their wrists cut by nylon cable ties. The hoods were gone, no anonymity, no theater. Just exposed faces blinking in disbelief at the man who had delivered them here with systematic precision. Bumpy Johnson stood with his overcoat open, cigarette suspended between two fingers, not looking at the men but rather at the rotary telephone bolted to the wall. Behind him, 3 of his Harlem lieutenants held tire irons, a blowtorch, and a brown canvas satchel that contained what was left of the midnight operation. The room felt cold, but the humiliation was boiling. Their grand dragon, Earl Stanton, was gagged with a strip of burlap. His nose was broken, leaking a slow line of red down his upper lip. His arrogance was gone, replaced with the flickering realization that the power he wielded in daylight had no currency in the geometry of this shed. There was only hierarchy, silence, and a rapidly closing window for mercy he had never once offered others. Bumpy finally turned. No yelling, no rage, just the verdict. "You hit my home," Bumpy said. His voice was judicial, stripped of theatrics. "You threatened my wife. You threatened my child. I won't argue. I won't negotiate. But I will educate." He nodded once. One of his men opened the satchel and dumped its contents onto the concrete floor. Wallets, watches, lodge pins, a stack of Polaroids, 2 Klansman robes folded with military precision, and several ivory-handled pistols. Beside this pile lay a sealed envelope clipped with a red string. 3 hours and 41 minutes earlier, 2:22 a.m., those exact men had been dragged out of their beds in a synchronized sweep across 3 counties. Not with bullets, not with chaos, with planning. Their phones disabled, their neighbors silent. Their families locked in basements for safekeeping. No alarms triggered, no headlines created, yet. Bumpy crouched down in front of Stanton and removed the gag. "What made you think Harlem wouldn't answer?" he asked. Stanton coughed blood and spat a slur. a final act of defiance from a man whose empire had never been tested by consequence. Bumpy didn't respond. He just reached down, grabbed one of the robes, and tossed it toward the blowtorch. In seconds, the fabric was burning, releasing a thick chemical smoke that curled against the rafters. The symbolism was not subtle. Stanton understood. Then came the financial dismantling, executed verbally, with the precision of a banker reading an audit. Bumpy explained how the night had unfolded while the clan slept. Their trucks, registered under false names, were now abandoned in Newark with their VIN plates removed. Their weapons caches had been seized and would be anonymously delivered to the FBI field office that afternoon. Their secret membership lists, kept in a metal box under Stanton's shed, were now photographed, copied, and addressed to 3 newspapers in sealed packages. Bumpy paused for effect. "You boys survived this room, and you'll still face a different problem. Exposure, embarrassment, consequences." The power dynamic was no longer racial, no longer regional, it was informational. In organized crime, reputation was currency. In white supremacist circles, anonymity was armor. Bumpy had punctured both. At 6:27 a.m., the rotary phone rang. One of Bumpy's men answered, listened silently, and nodded. "Packages are on the trucks," he reported. Bumpy looked at Stanton. At 9 a.m., the editors opened their mail. By noon, every man who ever wore your bedsheet knows you failed to protect them. You lose the crowd, you lose the cross, you lose everything. The violence that followed was not glorious. It was disciplined. No one died. But bones broke, fingers snapped, egos shattered. Stanton's right hand, the one he used to sign threats, was crushed under a tire iron. His lieutenant had his ring finger twisted until it dislocated sideways. They screamed. They begged. Bumpy smoked. When it ended, each man received a note pinned to their chest with a safety pin. The note read, "Your families are untouched. Next time, they won't be. Stay away from Harlem." Below the warning, a timestamp, 6:43 a.m., and nothing else. They were dumped near their own vehicles, alive but dishonored, with the tools of their terror burned, scattered, or repurposed against them. No gunshots, no bodies, no police report that could survive scrutiny without exposing their own crimes. It was smart violence executed with zero margin for retaliation. At 11:09 a.m., the first newspaper editor opened his mail. 3 envelopes, membership lists, meeting dates, minutes from rallies, names of deputies, bankers, judges, and businessmen who attended cross-burnings under the cover of darkness. The newsroom froze. Phones began ringing. Stanton's world collapsed with the slow precision of a controlled demolition. By afternoon, the Klan chapter was dissolved, its leadership hospitalized, its influence compromised, and its hypocrisy broadcast in whispers across 3 states. Harlem heard the outcome by nightfall. Word traveled faster than ink. The reckoning was complete. And the final irony hung over the narrative like smoke from the torched robe. The FBI would take credit for dismantling the chapter. History would cite federal pressure. Reporters would nod. Politicians would boast. But the truth, the cold, unauthorized, extrajudicial truth, belonged to one man. The same man Stanton had underestimated. Bumpy Johnson.